Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is Don Wolfensberger, Director of the Congress Project here and your moderator today. We're pleased that today's event is being co-sponsored by the Center's Comparative Urban Studies Project under the able leadership of Blair Rubel, and we have representing them today and helping us out Allison Garland. Allison, raise your hand, and thank you all for all your assistance. I wanted to start early, even though I know we have a number of other people that had signed up and probably will be trickling in here, but the Secretary does have a very important Hill appointment at 4:30, so we have agreed to the following format, and that is that Assistant Secretary Marquez will speak for roughly 20 minutes and then take some questions from our panelists, and then we'll open up to the audience for questions, and then she'll leave a little before 4 o'clock thereabouts, and then in the second hour we'll hear from our other three panelists, Josh Sapochny, William Barnes, and Michael Fletcher, and then we'll take questions from the audience of them at the about the last half hour of that second hour. So that'll be the format for today. Before we go further, let me just make two little public service announcements of service to the Wilson Center. If you have Blackberries or cell phones, could you please turn them off, because they have a tendency to interfere with our audio system, and we are being live webcast today, so we want to make sure we have a quality transmission here to the rest of the world. I should also mention that we have a grant from Chevron for a 2-year series that we are doing on the overall theme of policy making, public opinion, and the media, and so we're very grateful for that. Third announcement I want to make is following this program at 5 o'clock, we will have a reception in the hallway outside here. You're all welcome to that, a little wine and cheese where we can carry on the discussion in an informal manner. As you know, the title for today's program is National Urban Policy: Is a New Day Dawning? And for this, I've really departed a little from my usual format where I have a member of Congress from each party and a scholar and a journalist, because I think it's very important with the new administration in town to hear from the executive branch as well before we get back to our usual format in discussing various policies in our succeeding seminars. But we're very pleased to have with us today Assistant Secretary for Community Planning and Development, Mercedes Marquez. She comes to us from Los Angeles, where she was director of the Los Angeles Department of Housing, but she does have experience previously in the Department of Housing and Urban Development back under the Clinton administration. From, I think, 1997 through 2000, she was counsel to then Secretary Andrew Cuomo. And so she does know where the various offices are in that vast building, and probably some of the career folks that were around when she was last here are probably still there to help out. But she had gotten her start as a lawyer with a law firm in Los Angeles doing a lot of litigation on various types of urban problems, and she has had experience also when she left the Clinton administration. She had gone back to the private sector with an urban development firm where she was a vice president. So she has been in the private sector, the public sector, in federal government, in local government, and so she brings to this job a great deal of experience. As I say, when she finishes her talk, we'll first of all take questions from our three panelists, our academic, our scholar, and our scholar, our League of Cities person, and our journalist, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So without further ado, let me introduce Assistant Secretary Marquez.
I'm height challenged, so if you don't mind, I'll bring this forward a little bit. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for the opportunity to come and speak with you today. It gives us a chance, those of us that are digging in every day, to take a step back and reflect a little bit. And it's a wonderful opportunity to be able to do this kind of a discussion every couple of months, actually, and you update a little bit of what you've learned, and think a little bit deeper about what is achievable and what perhaps has to wait a little bit, right? I guess I would say that folks have asked me to talk a little bit about what HUD's role might be, what's happening with urban policy generally, and what my role is more specifically in that. And I guess I would say that as a whole, the way I feel about it, and pardon that it's not particularly beautiful in prose, but I feel like my job is to be pragmatically aspirational. And that it is to take a look at what's happened. Sometimes I say to the secretary that some ideas are so old they're new. And those of you who've been around a lot, I think, know what I'm talking about, right? That there are very few unique ideas. That doesn't mean that as we bring them forward, they can't be recast for a new time with new challenges. But some of the things that we used to do worked. And we're taking a look at some of them as we talk about some new things. So, for instance, we know when you think back at HUD's founding in 1965, cities were actually burning. And it was a time when HUD was brought about not only to work on housing, but to really focus on issues of neighborhood and community, and to address what was thought to be a problem in our cities. And it turns out that nowadays, as time has gone by, cities are becoming part of the solution. And in fact, we're understanding that as we refocus, some of our best opportunity for scale, for sustainability, lie in a metropolitan understanding. So I'd say for that reason, what would it, HUD is trying to recapture its initial mission. What was left undone? And in my particular division, community planning and development, we're responsible not only, for most of the programs that HUD administers in terms of cash and entitlement programs, but also for the issues of some of the planning and a lot of the economic development proposals come through there. And I'll tell you, frankly, that some of the most anemic parts of HUD have to do with economic development. So among our biggest challenges are how to redirect that, re-understand that in the scope of what's going on now. Okay, so now we see cities are more of a solution than they are a problem. And in fact, you might have read just most recently, I think yesterday in the Chicago newspapers, the Brookings Institution let out a new study that shows that the problems of poverty have now overshadowed in suburbs are greater than in the inner cities. That's the new stats. So things have changed pretty dramatically. So we see that cities that were once in real trouble, like Boston, Seattle, newer cities like Salt Lake City, they were losing their population in the 60s. But in the last decade, they've really started to come back. And there are some real reasons for that, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But I think important to think about that is the frame of the metro region. And it seems that those who begin to work beyond the boundaries of city are doing better and will do better in the long run as they understand their interdependence. I think that's particularly true as we look at issues of transit. In some ways, we have to take a step back because a lot of the planning that is done in cities is done around transit. But one could argue that the planning should first be done from a metropolitan point of view of what that transit should service, rather than all of that infrastructure going into transit and then being faced, and now we have this and we didn't plan about what the city actually needed. And that's true in more cities than I think many of us would like to admit, but it is true. So we have to rethink where those planning dollars are. And like anything, we seem often to be driven by what's working where the dollar is and not at the whole. And that, for us in the Obama administration, is certainly a huge challenge to rethink that. And there are ways in which that is beginning to happen. But we know that in metropolitan areas, 90 cents of every dollar in our economy are generated in metro areas. We house more than 2/3 of America's population in metro areas now. But this crisis has brought some real problems. Right? A lot of cities have really lost the gains that they had been making. The tax base has decreased dramatically. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. I want to get into what we're going to do, but we can't ignore that this is true. It's also true, I think, that in the last several years, we started to lose a focus on urban areas. We stopped taking a look at the incentives that would push communities forward. We stopped understanding what it meant to get something to scale. And now, with diminished tax bases, with lacks of incentives, and communities really facing a hard time, local government, with layoffs and furloughs, I can tell you that I've had a report from staff very concerned. They talked to someone in a local agency that we deal with who was upset to the point of tears because of how bad the furloughs were, and they had to get reports in, and they didn't know how to do it. So the stress that is felt at a local level is really quite palpable. I've heard many stories of that type, of what it means to lose this. Now, the stimulus has helped. It has closed the gap on deals. I can tell you from a housing point of view, it has taken deals that were completely falling apart and put them right back on track. So it has saved jobs. It has saved a lot of money, actually, because when you have a project that stalls, it's a very expensive endeavor to restart it again, right? So the money that we had, for instance, in TCAP has saved, millions of dollars of investment, millions and millions, actually, of dollars of investment. And so again, new federalism focused on place, both pragmatic and aspirational. I think that our job now is both to think from a place at 30,000 feet above the air, where we can understand where the connections are not happening, better understand integration, talk about incentives to really push robust strategies, and start to define what scale means, start to define what catalytic means. Now, the federal government used to do that, but it also used to go down to the level of telling you what color paint you should use to rehab a home, right? So they had big thinking, but they also got lost in what was important in detail. For us, it's important both to understand those trends, but also to understand what it is like to work in the trenches. So you have to be able, and this is where I'm talking pragmatic, you have to know what's going on Main Street. Aspirational, you have to look above. And those of you in academia and who have done this work understand that that's often difficult to find in one person at the same time, right? So you tend to push in one direction in the other. And here we're trying to bring teams together that have both the knowledge base, the research base, but also have real life understandings and experience of what local government really is, how it actually functions, what decisions are made, and what conflicts live side by side in the system of governing and of living everyday life in a community. So, as we move from 30,000 feet only, abstract arguments begin to come into focus. And you see better and clearer interactions between housing and other policy domains, whether it's health or it's education or it's energy or it's transit. You start to be able to talk about that. Now, we've seen dramatic changes in government. And I guess what I'd say about that is what I was just talking about. When the government withdrew from asking hard questions and evaluating outcomes, and a good example of how that happened is the implementation history of the block grant program, for instance, right? When we moved away from the notion that government could actually solve problems, right, we adopted more and more and more the understanding that if we facilitated bringing the resources to local and state government, that they knew what to do. Now, as we did that, it's not that folks didn't know what to do. But it's hard to do that alone, because if you're only on Main Street, then you also don't have a view of 30,000 feet above. So we sacrificed one in favor of the other. And now I think we're coming back into a balance. So what do I mean by that? I mean that what's literally happened in the notion of block granting is that local government always knows what to do. And the federal government has, in some ways, I can tell you at HUD, there's real truth to this, moved just to monitoring whether or not you were reporting the money correctly, whether you were filing the right reports. So monitoring at the broadest scale. but we stopped paying attention to what outcomes were actually being reached, right? We stopped asking questions about what real leverage was and evaluating whether you were really doing that well or not. Now, in that time, it meant that who we hired in the federal government to do this were people who were wonderful at process, wonderful at getting the money out. But over time, we lost the expertise on urban planning that we had when the organization was founded. And we started to hire more and more folks who knew how to get the money out. And now I'd say what we're trying to do is make sure that we help local communities get the resources they need. But we are also attempting to help them with capacity. Because now, after so many years of block granting, capacity has been lost at many levels. In the federal government, surely, but also in local government, it's been lost. Because when the idea is getting the money out, and you're not held to any standard of what it means to solve the problem, local government also begins to forget how to do that. Not to mention that there is so much turnover of staff in local government, and so little money for training and understanding what the true skill sets, that it becomes difficult. It is also true that our world has become more complex. And what it took 15 years ago to build a housing unit it takes much more than that now. It takes a complex understanding of mixed finance, right? It takes a real understanding of the private sector to do it well. It takes real relationships to build the level of trust, because like anything, when a city is going to enter into a private-public partnership, it is about trust. I will tell you from my own experience in Los Angeles. As I was trying to build a housing department for this century, at one point I was building an equity fund of $100 million with private lenders. And I will tell you, they did what anybody in business does. They came and they underwrote me. They came and they sat with me. They flew in from across the country and talked to me about what my business values were, right? How I would handle the money. Would I be afraid to call someone out, right? Because now I was working with private dollars and not government dollars that perhaps I could forget about. And if you don't know how to do that, it's very difficult to attract the level of partnership that is necessary in more complex types of transactions. And as a result, it is more difficult for a city to reach what I would call a more mature financing structure, right? Whether it's for affordable housing or it's for economic development projects. If you can't go beyond the use of the federal funds, right? If you can't go beyond the use of the federal funds to leverage with other funds, you will always be at a level that is never at scale, because you'll never be understanding what scale could actually be. And we get stuck in limiting to the size of the box in which we can dream, in which we can work, and what government is capable of. So that's one of the huge differences. It also means understanding that in the absence of an important federal role, that others stepped in beautifully. The philanthropic community stepped in. A lot of the research and evaluation that has been done in the last 20 years, right, is really owed to the enormous effort and commitment of the philanthropic sector to come in and fill it. In the federal government, we're speaking to them. We've spent an awful lot of time in these last 6 months, understanding lessons learned, going back over different projects, and getting a clearer sense of how we would work together. They tell us that they hadn't been invited in a very long time to talk. I will also tell you that my partners, my colleagues in community development in cities, have also told me that they hadn't been at HUD for a very long time to talk. So that they received the dollars, but they didn't, and so they felt a partnership in terms of resources, but they didn't feel a partnership necessarily in the ownership of the problems that they faced and help in getting through those. That's what they tell me over and over again. So we've had the government change, philanthropic sector has come in, and visionary leaders in local government and state government have done wondrous things. But that's uneven progress, right? It was left to ensure that those that had that ability, that vision, that level of training, that level of will would move forward, while many others did not. And what we see now after all these years are some have gone forward because of those reasons, but others who are much smaller, have fewer resources, are really stymied. So we're looking, what do you do? Understanding that one size does not fit all. Let me tell you a little bit about what we're trying to do to even that out. Because block granting has worked in many instances, I said, where there's vision, there's will, there's commitment, it has worked well. But yet, only 7.6% of CDBG on an annual basis is used for economic development. Now that's a $4 billion program. If we don't find a way to help communities, to incentivize them, to build a bridge to scale and to catalytic investment, we're going to continue just to service minimum needs. We're not going to move beyond that to the level of scale that is required. Now, when you only have, that's among the most flexible money that most cities receive. And certainly in a time of strife, they use them for public services. But yet only 7.6% used for economic development. So what we're attempting to do is to take the CDBG program and link it to other things that we're doing. Now let me give you a sense of some of these other things. We're focused on a place-based strategy. And one of the reflections of that at HUD is something called choice neighborhoods, right, where we are now looking beyond the Hope 6 program in public housing, because we have learned that despite how wonderful it has been, that it takes more than a concentration on the remodernization of public housing to help bring a community out of poverty. It's housing plus. And Choice Neighborhoods focuses in on housing, not just public housing, but other types of subsidized housing and even privately held housing, to work on a community plan and to also focus on schools. However, there is one part of Hope 6 that it was always thought about, but that money was not found for, and that is the commercial linkages. How do you bring them back from an economic development point of view? And while it is not my place to tell you what's coming in the 2011 budget, I'm sure you'll all look on February 1st, I can tell you that the President has thought a lot about how we connect those two. And I think you could look forward to seeing new programs that focus in this way. The other thing we're doing as we look at issues of sustainability is linking them across HUD. So let me give you an example. We would focus our underwriting criteria across all of the programs. So in other words, how do you break a silo, right? And it's to actually talk about your underwriting all the way across, so that we may find in a choice neighborhood competitive program that we might say, you know what, it's time for you to have some skin in the game. What percentage of your CDBG are you going to pledge in order to get that commitment? So it's not about mandates, but it's about incentives, right? We have to focus the investment. So this is what we would do. We're not forcing you to do it, but those of you that want to see where the future is lying, commit some of your dollars. Another program that is not used nearly as much as it could be, and that is a great program, is the 108 program, right? Actually, very few communities take out 108 loans. I had a mayor who shall remain nameless come to pitch what was really a very nice transit program. Great concept, good idea, very well thought out. But when I meet with a mayor, I have before me how they're doing as a city. Right? I understand their expenditure rates. I know what's obligated and what's not. I know if they've taken out 108 nodes. In fact, so I know what is available to them. And I said to this mayor, your city has never taken out a 108 loan ever. And if you did that, it looks to me like 40% of your gap you would be able to fill yourself. This makes this project more doable, he said to me. Well, we want to save that for something very important. I said, I thought you told me this is the most important thing you had going on in your city. So right? So we've got to move from understanding, well, someday we'll use that, I'd rather have a grant, to if you really mean it, put some skin in the game, right? Make sure you're really watching it. Have an incentive to do well. So I think that will be true then for choice neighborhoods. We're also talking about it in terms of sustainable communities. You know, in the 2010 budget, we're looking at planning grants for sustainability. We believe that we're going to connect CDBG all the way across these programs. And some other things that I'm really not at liberty to talk about quite yet. If you'd asked me a month later, I could talk about them more in depth. The other thing that we're focused in on in my division is capacity building and technical assistance. Now, this is the trench work, right? This is the work of Main Street. And in some ways, it will be perhaps the most unheralded work that we do, but it may in the end be the most important work that we do, because it focuses in on real capacity. And let's talk about that for a bit. Technical assistance in the federal government, certainly at HUD, had come to mean monitoring. Did you cross all the T's? Did you dot all the I's? Did you file the reports on time? But it was not, and often we asked folks who are having problems, so what do you think you need? Now, if someone who is having problems, maybe they need an assessment. Maybe they need help in understanding what they need, rather than asking people who really aren't clear what they need, and then giving them what they need, and maybe it's not the right thing. Do you understand how this starts to work? So we're being very pragmatic about it. Technical assistance in terms of monitoring is important. It is our role to ensure that dollars are spent well. That, for me, is called program assistance. If you're working on a real program, let's say you're working on the neighborhood stabilization program, and you don't quite understand in your market, right, what your formula for buying properties for rehabilitation should be, what is the kind of specific zone of level of rehab that you should do that will get you out of this problem. That's an expertise. If you don't have it, from our point of view, right, that's capacity building. And in the way we're handling it now, we're sending experts to you with an assessment we do with you to help you with very specific problems. If we are in communities that have broader issues of capacity, right, like they really don't understand how to work some of the spreadsheets, and in small communities and in not so small communities, this is often the case. That, for me, is technical assistance, right? So by separating it out, we're making a real investment in local government by helping them work better. And in the end, we think that we'll do, over time, a better job of rebuilding the community development industry by giving real help and by being very honest about what it is that we're seeing and we're not seeing. So that begins the way that we're getting this done. I know that it's not very sexy, but it is the real work of communities, right? Helping them with their plans. Now, the last thing that we're going to do, in this sense, it's big, in this year, 2010, is we're taking a brand new look at what is called a consolidated plan. And that is the process by which local government reports to HUD how it plans to use its CDBG dollars and its affordable housing dollars and some other funds. And what we're hoping to do, again, a large view and a very specific view. What should HUD's role be in providing data? Right? We know so much more now since this was thought about. The data is so much more readily available, at least to us at the federal level. What should now be our responsibility in terms of making regular data known and available to state and local governments so that they don't have to hire people that they cannot afford to have to get the data that HUD could more readily have available? Let me give you an example where this could work. In both neighborhood stabilization programs that we're implementing now, 1 and 2, so whether it is a formula grant program or a competitive program, what HUD did, and this is, nice, the policy development and research arm, and I think there's somebody here, and community planning and development actually worked together in a way that those of us in the field, because I was in Los Angeles at the time, seemed seamless. Now, because I'd been at HUD before, I knew that it hadn't been that easy. But it looked easy, and I was proud of them because it looked easy. They made it easy for us to pick the right places. HUD actually put out census tracts for the entire country that were the hardest hit by foreclosures. And they said to you, this is how they're ranked. When you provide a plan, fit them in within this. So every community in the United States, right, for a formula grant program under NSP 1, that's 309 grantees, each had its own information. When we went forward for a competition, a national competition for NSP 2, we put out the data for the entire country. Now, in Los Angeles, because I come from it's a big department, and I had my own policy division, and I had folks who were great researchers who could do advanced GS mapping, we did our own maps. And what was really pleasant to know is that when those maps came, my map matched HUD's map exactly. I can't tell you the joy from the point of view of a local to know that we were all in sync on what we were doing. But that means HUD is pretty right on it. In fact, I have not yet heard a single complaint from any locality in the country that that data was incorrect. So what is it that HUD could do to provide greater data to make community plans more real, right? What could we provide about poverty rates or about school lunch programs or all the things that are better indicators of where you might focus in a community? So we're talking about that. When we're talking apples and apples, it is easier to ask a community to do a needs assessment, right? Because we're looking across the board at everything together. So I think there will be a greater emphasis on that. There will also be a greater emphasis on a real narrative of what you're trying to achieve in your community, right? And perhaps not just from the point of view of how you're using CDBG dollars or home dollars, but more from a point of view of how are you attacking your needs? How are you dealing with the homeless? How are you working on issues of public housing? How are you going to fill the gaps for working poor families? And what does that mean for jobs? So in other words, if we help provide a context, we could start to see a full narrative that will also help at local government. Having come from local government, I can tell you that some of the most, because the federal government is siloed, so is local government. Right? So is local government. So that depending on how a public housing authority is governed, very difficult to have a real talk with a public housing authority and a redevelopment agency and a community development agency and a housing agency to all reach one view. There are some cities that have achieved it with overall comprehensive housing plans. We're going to try to help more communities do that with a simple template, right? And then tie that into economic development. This is the work we'll be doing all year. We'll be going across the country, asking lots of questions, taking in tons of input. I guess I can tell you that because so many of us come from the trenches, we feel more from there than we do from any new perch, right? We see the problems and understand the problems and analyze solutions from what would that mean? What would I have done if this had come to me? And so a much, I don't know, better, but certainly a different sense. And as I speak to my colleagues around the country that are really struggling with these issues, we see that our eyes are meeting one another about what to do and the kind of conversations we'll have and the questions that are raised. So I guess I can tell you, again, pragmatically aspirational, right? Trying to make it possible for local government to reach beyond what it has now. Trying to help us understand what scale is and how we may bring resources that help get you to scale. Right? But always rooted in real change. And that for me is really without ideology. That's a pragmatic thing, and it's different in every community. And that is a value that we respect. So for today, that's what I can tell you today. Ask me in 3 months, and I'll hopefully know a little bit more.
Thank you. Let's go first to our panel. I'll introduce them a little bit more in detail when their turn comes up, but we'll start with Josh Sapochny from Michigan State University. Any questions for the Secretary?
I do. Two questions, actually, and they're kind of related, and they're not too tough, I promise. The first question is, one of the kind of the things that I know academics and scholars kind of struggle with when we're talking about this issue of national urban policy is, what do we mean? What are we actually sort of talking about here? And you mentioned a couple of the components of President Obama's 2008 speech, and then his speech more recently, from a couple of days ago with the USCM, about cities being part of the solution, not the problem, the sort of regional tensions and taking those seriously. But the third part that sort of struck me was that federal coordination was taken very seriously in each of the speeches. So I guess one of my questions is, what's sort of HUD's relationship with these other agencies that have a hand in these urban policies, right? And sort of in addition, the relationship with the White House Office of Urban Affairs, which we haven't heard a lot about in the last couple of months.
Okay.
I'll end with that one.
Okay. Federal coordination is actually quite robust. There are now meetings, I think I've attended 3, that are meetings very high level between Department of Transportation, EPA, HUD, USDA is now joining in, particularly as we look at issues of transit and sustainability. What I can tell you is that we have informal agreements that are already functioning that will be eventually formalized, where we're agreeing at this point to sit in on each other's competitions. We're also, so we will actually work together on competitions across the board. We're also starting to identify, and we have some identified already, real barriers. Let me give you an example. In one of the agencies, they will not accept a CDBG pledge from a community as a match to their competition. And that has made it very difficult for some cities to compete. They are now working very hard on removing that barrier, right? So they have to go through probably some changes in Congress to do it, but they're committing to do it so that we tie in better together. So things as seemingly simple as that, but it's never that simple, to actually agreeing to sit in on each other's competitions and work values together and work points together, and to help preference one of the other if people are following different policies. We're working on what might be a joint definition of sustainability, right? How will we understand that? So that's one example of coordination. There are actually others. I'm working right now with the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico on community, I'd say capacity building. And not only am I doing it from community planning and development, but now in my own agency, public housing has joined in, so we're doing it jointly. And I'm now meeting with USDA as we're trying to figure out how we might do this jointly because of some of the things that we're learning. And I'll tell you, no stress about that. I mean, none at all, really. And I can tell you that's different than the last time I was here. That was a very hard conversation to have the last time I was here. And this time around, folks are much more open to it and calling and saying, I met you at this meeting. Do you think we could, do this? We're doing the same thing with the Department of Commerce. Easy reaching across. So that's one thing. Now, the Office of Urban Affairs. I can tell you that I speak to them very, very often. And it's actually a very nice partnership. They have managed to bring together many agencies at the table to talk about specific issues. So they are sponsoring many different, I'd say, Task Force I at this point, it's so many of them, to have discussions and drill down on specific issues. Many different folks at the table. And I'll tell you that I've gotten great ideas there. I've made great contacts in other agencies there. And that has, in some ways, easily led to some of these other collaborations that I'm talking about. I'll also tell you that as we're working through some difficult issues, particularly in economic development, I feel a very strong relationship with them, real understanding, very open discussion about what to do, and real support.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Just to follow up on that, do you see the overall goal of the White House Office of Urban Affairs to really come up with a comprehensive urban strategy?
I can't speak for them if that is their specific goal. I would imagine that it certainly is a goal to have a coordinated strategy. This is very complex, and I think it might in some ways be a mistake, because as soon as you have it, it will be old, right? So I think one of the things that is the most difficult for us in government is to understand how quickly an idea becomes stale, right? That events surpass our reality very quickly. So I think to the degree that you have more flexible relationships on programs, it is actually better because it will allow us to be much more responsive. I think so much so that in some of the programs that I've been thinking about, they're much more flexible, right? They get to ideas, they get to outcomes, but they will give us more flexibility to change from year to year what the focus will be based on what's going on. And in a world that is now moving so fast with technology, I think it's actually a little dangerous to get set on one document that you print.
Okay. William Barnes of the National League of Cities.
Talk into this thing?
Sure.
One of the last winter, a report was handed to the secretary from the University of Pennsylvania, sort of things to think about to make HUD better. The accumulated wisdom of 100 or so semi-skilled intellectuals who sat and talked to each other and put that together, but a respectable document. One of the themes of that document was the culture of HUD. And the word dysfunctional came up from time to time. Now, you had touched on... you have... probably your voice was one of the ones who said that. But you are clearly part of the change, just the way you talk about this. And you've spoken about this in various ways. But would you talk some more about how that works with people in place? Right? It's not, you talked about the kinds of people that used to be hired and monitoring versus goal enforcing and so on. But what's the management plan for working with people to change a culture that goes back pretty far?
Yes. Well, I mean, I can give testament to the fact that when I returned, I was amazed at how many hugs I received from people that I knew from the last time that I served. It was very nice, but also, wow, we're still here. There are a number of ways that the culture of HUD is being reviewed and discussed quite directly. One, we've engaged in a strategic planning process. Now, lots of people, lots of organizations engage in strategic planning. But we're talking about a process that actually embraced the field, that brought people in, people went out, that look to things from what are our real goals, what are we trying to solve, to how are we going to hold ourselves accountable. So there's a whole portion in this plan that looks at our culture, that looks at outcomes, so that not only grantees will be held accountable for outcomes, that we will be held accountable for outcomes. So we start with these kind of new values. It's one that recognizes that federal employees have almost no opportunity for training. I don't know if you know this, but in many of our programs, like CDBG, we don't permit staff to be trained at all. So we can't be surprised. It's actually not statutorily permitted to use money for staff training. So I guess what I'm saying is that this was part of what happened with block granting and the understanding that the federal government didn't know, that local government did. We actually wrote in to not train people. So we're about changing that. Let me tell you one of the ways that we're working on that. The Secretary has worked long and hard, and I believe that the President's support and the Congress has supported something called the Transformation Initiative. And it requests a certain percentage of HUD's dollars to go into a much more general fund that will do a number of things very specifically. One, our systems are as old as Methuselah. And we're going to embark on a complete reinvention of those systems. Now, having finally received the funding gratefully from Congress in our 2010 budget, we are well on our way. We have also not done a lot of program evaluation. So another area that we did not focus in on was in PD&R. We didn't give them enough funding and they lost staff. We now have a much more robust evaluation process. We have also grouped dollars together for technical assistance. And I can tell you that today I brought forward some recommendations to the Secretary about that. And for the first time in what may be history, I can tell you that there are at least 5 proposals within that cut across silos. So that in my instance, I'm CPD. I brought an application together with CPD, public housing, and multifamily finance, all got together to do a cross-cutting application for technical assistance, how we would deal with skill sets, not with program silos. Never been done before. And ours isn't the only application that's come in that is actually across divisions. I think that as we're starting to understand what we're trying to achieve, I'll tell you in some ways I have found folks, they were really demoralized. And that is beginning to change. You know, there are some personal stories of what people say. They're personal to them. But there are many HUD employees who have been waiting for this day to dawn. There are many who've been waiting. So it's not just a situation where you'll say, oh, it's a disgruntled bureaucrat. There are many people who have tons of energy, who couldn't say what they thought. You know how that is as you change administrations and parties. People put away their good ideas in a drawer and they wait for the right opportunity, right? That's what happens in the federal government. And some of those have come out. But with the energy that the Secretary is bringing on rewarding, not just saying you will do it, but rewarding cross-cutting thinking, right? I am certain that some of these applications for technical assistance will rise to the top because people took a chance and they thought hard about how they would actually do it, right? What's similar and how they could save money in costs by bringing it together. So those are some of the real things that are actually happening that show great promise.
Michael Fletcher is a reporter with the Washington Post. He has a little niche beat called the Obama administration. Michael, a question?
Sure. The president, one of the hallmarks of kind of his vision of urban policy, as you said, is this kind of metropolitan, kind of regional vision. Mm-hmm. But, you know, as a reporter who, long before covering the Obama administration, I covered local government in Baltimore, and what I would see there is there was a lot of talk of regionalism, but a lot of political rivalry, a lot of political antagonism. How do you break through that? How do you encourage subdivisions to work together? I know what you said about Brookings and their study about how the suburbs are looking more like the cities, but I'm not sure that suburban leaders see it that way, and I'm just wondering.
You know, I was having a talk with somebody about that exactly today, that it is difficult to break down those jurisdictional divisions because you have to give up control when you do it, and you'll have to share money. But I see some things beginning to take shape. And I will tell you, we just finished the NSP2 competition, right? So the neighborhood stabilization program that focuses in on vacant and abandoned properties in neighborhoods. We received $15 billion of requests for just shy of $2 billion in funds. Nearly 500 applications. 56 in the end were awarded because we were actually rewarding both need and real innovation. Over half of the applications were consortia applications. Historic. Now, one of the things that we did is that we incentivized consortia. So in the end, over half of the awardees are within consortia. Some local and even one state. The state of Michigan came in as one state consortia. They worked it out with multiple cities and nonprofits on who would do what. Amazing. We saw some national applications come in where different local governments were working with different nonprofits and a national provider to come in to do it together. But this is what I see happening. In smaller communities, smaller economies, that is going to be easier than in larger metropolitan areas because it is easier for them to see upfront the benefits to them. They understand more readily, I would say, the challenges that they face. They understand more the limits of what their funding can get them. And that if they if they come together, what they could do would be more powerful, that it will buy more, and that they will stop spending $5 on a $1 admin problem. Larger cities, some could argue, I guess, are metro areas in themselves, right? That it's so complex that I think it's going to take much more than grant funds to do that. And it may be at the level where we started on the issue of transportation, right? And this issue of jobs. These are something that stump us all. And so it may be on those bigger issues that cities are going to have to come together with the ring of cities around them. So that's what I can tell you. In this competition, no major city came in as a consortia. But many small and medium-sized cities did.
And one other quick question on an unrelated topic. With all this talk in the air in Washington with the budget coming out, there's a lot of talk of a domestic spending freeze. How does that comport with kind of the HUD's vision? I mean, are there going to be the resources going forward to kind of do the kinds of things you'd like to do?
Well, I'm not, I can't tell you exactly what's going to be in that budget, but I can tell you, right? But I can tell you, for instance, one measure for mayors and county executives is the administration's commitment to fully funding CDBG, for instance. And I think that in a very short time, when the 2011 budget comes out, county executives and mayors across the country will be very happy with what they see.
Maybe we should have had this next Monday when the budget's coming out. But we have time for one or two questions from the audience. Let's start with Sonia here. And then Allison, if you have one too, as our co-sponsor, feel free after Sonia. Identify yourself, please.
Yeah, Sonia Michelle. I'm Director of U.S. Studies here at the Wilson Center. One way of reading this phenomenon of the fact that suburban poverty has now shifted from urban to suburban is that maybe cities are no longer affordable for lower income people. So, or the cities are becoming, that gentrification is really becoming predominant in cities. So, is there a conversation at all about how to make cities places where people of all different income levels can live? Is that something of a concern to you?
You have hit on my biggest concern, and on maybe my pet issue as I come forward, because that is really very true. I can tell you that we're taking a look within the strategic plan at paying attention to anywhere where HUD has made a federal dollar investment, to understanding how we would preserve as much of the affordable housing around it. In other words, it would have to be in their plan. I've often, as a local advocate, I'm actually a civil rights litigator. So most of my career has been spent suing government, including the one that I work for. And so I've always thought it was kind of interesting that the secretary and the president would ask a civil rights litigator to come and be in charge of the money. But here I am. And with that comes a real focus on the issues of gentrification and balance. So we are absolutely pursuing policies that require much earlier in the process, at the planning stage, to take account for who is there, right? But it also, let me take it a step further, that as we're modernizing public housing, that is also a problem. There is a study that makes clear that about 30% of the residents of public housing are actually special needs tenants. And often when we've done Hope 6, we haven't really assessed who was really living there. And in the end, some of these issues we had with displacement and why they can't get a job and all these kinds of things are about not having assessed accurately what their needs were. I've sued about it, actually. So I can tell you that I care about it an awful lot, and I bring it up an awful lot, and I'm not alone in the building at all on these issues. So yes, it's very important to us.
Allison, did you have a question?
No, not right now.
All right, well, other hands, we take one or two more. Right here. Microphone.
You'd mentioned that the...
Identify yourself, please.
My name's Ed Gilliland, formerly with the International Economic Development Council. You mentioned the 7.6% of CDBG for economic development is too low. It should go up. Can you talk about what areas of economic development you think should need more addressing or more consideration?
Well, again, cities come in different shapes and sizes with different problems. So I want to be careful that I'm not prescribing what the solutions are, because that would be just unbelievably arrogant. But I do think that among the more important things we have to focus in on really is job creation and training. And that is one reason why there is some discussion about empowerment zones. What did they achieve? What didn't they achieve? How would we, if we were to do them again, how would we recast them? And how would we focus in on that investment? I also think that there are, scale means different things in different types of investment. And what I think is important is that whatever it is you're doing, that we figure out together what part comes from a CDBG investment, and then what is the leverage that the federal government could help with that is different. Because one of the difficulties of CDBG is that, we have to admit that there isn't enough money, whether it's all the housing programs or all the economic development programs, to solve the actual need, right? And so if we get locked into that this is a universe and it can solve every problem, it can't. So what are the best things for your economy? And in HUD, one of the things I really like about what I'm seeing and how the conversations are going is a real understanding of submarkets. And that as a result, there are different needs in those markets. And what makes sense in the Rust Belt, right? What makes sense in an auto city, right, is different from what makes sense out in the West. So,
one more brief question. There we go.
Yep. This is a really simple question. You mentioned that you were going to release data sets. I was wondering if you were thinking of releasing any of the studies that I know a lot of studies that HUD or PD&R does don't actually get released to the general public. I was wondering if you might consider releasing those too.
The Obama transparency.
Yes. I mean,
exactly.
Move?
I can tell you that the Assistant Secretary for Research, right, Raphael Bostic, has a great commitment to transparency. Right, and so his is one of the programs in the 2010 budget that's gotten a huge boost to look at evaluation. It would do us no good to do the evaluation and not let people know what it was.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking the Secretary for being here.
No, pardon me. I know I have very little control of my schedule myself.
Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure meeting you.
Let me now introduce our guest scholar from Michigan State University, Joshua Sapochny, who is a newly minted PhD, received his degree last year, and was snatched up immediately by one of the more prestigious schools from my part of the country, Michigan State University. We had your Congressman, Mike Rogers, here a few months ago, so he spoke very highly, not of you, but of the university and the town.
I'll take what I can get.
I don't think he knew you yet, but in any event, Josh has prepared an original paper for this program that draws on his dissertation, but it fits nicely into our overall theme for the seminar series on policymaking, the media, and public opinion. And he has some tremendous data sets and so on, but I think he tells us a little bit about, or quite a bit, about the sort of the ebbs and of reform and attention to the urban policy area. And with that, I will turn things over to you, Josh.
Great. Thanks so much, Don. I'm going to sit if that's okay.
Sure.
Because I need the laptop. Okay. And obviously, thanks to all of you for having me and giving me a chance to talk about this ongoing research with you and to learn from your experiences as well. As I said, the paper I'm presenting today is on the sort of evolution of the contours of national urban policy as part of a sort of a book-length project. And in the book-length project, there'll be lots of sort of egg-heady political science theorizing, but not today, I promise. And if I do, please call me out on it. But so obviously, I sort of welcome your feedback as I'm sort of puzzling through things and still sort of collecting data as well. But I'll ask you to hold the questions to the end, so I don't filibuster for the whole hour. So the key questions that are going to drive just the talk today in the paper are threefold. And the first is, how and in what context have urban problems been portrayed? And I'm interested generally in sort of the federal policy agenda, meaning the sort of legislative agenda, the presidential agenda as well, and also sort of a public opinion and media, what some agenda-setting scholars would call the systemic agenda. So, the patterns of sort of interest in urban concerns within these different policy venues and across them as well, sort of the relationship between them. Second, how and why has this portrayal changed over time? We have a sort of a conception of what has happened to federal urban policy over the years, and so do my data jibe with that, and if not, why? And finally, what are the implications for policymakers? So this is a bit of a I'm outside my comfort zone as an untenured professor of political science here. So I'll try my best to offer up some tangible suggestions. But before I dive into the data, just a quick word about what do we mean by national urban policy when we talk about it. And there's considerable inconsistency across scholarship, and this is not just within political science, but just generally across social sciences, planning, and so forth. So what do we mean? And I think the difficulty in sort of coming up with an answer to what is national urban policy is the issue of the sort of thorniness of the concept of urbanism. It encompasses both function and space. Are we focusing on these sort of functionally distinct problems like mass transit, like wastewater management? Or are we focusing something more sort of general, more overarching, like potentially the goals in the Carter new partnership, or ostensibly in the Obama administration's investment, right? So what do we mean when we're talking about national urban policy? And the sort of second concern is, well, the issue context makes a difference, right? Urbanism is imbued in these sort of race-based and class-based and sort of regional tensions. Right, so how the problem of urban America, right, is defined makes a difference. And finally, as Professor Wollman has suggested in the past, there's no distinct policy subsystem that sort of organizes attention to urban concerns. Right, there's a slew of subsystems that deal with functional aspects of urban policy, but no one real sort of political formation of interest groups, of bureaucratic actors, of congressional committees that kind of organize policymaking that and sort of contain the scope of conflict. So I'm taking a sort of a more holistic view of the urban policy agenda, and I'm saying it encompasses these three dimensions. And the first is these policies that address development, these sort of traditional hallmark ways to think about urban issues, development of the physical space, so housing infrastructure, development policies more generally. The second, policies addressing problems that are more severe in high-density areas, such as crime and pollution, right? And finally, these overarching solutions to these sort of place-based problems. So Carter's new partnership, as I mentioned, ostensibly the Obama investment. So how to put this into practice? Well, because there's been so many sort of ebbs and flows, as Don alluded to earlier, it's important, I think, to get a sense of this over a considerable amount of time. So I'm looking over the last half century, give or take. And again, over a couple of what I'm calling policy-making venues. So the systemic agenda, so public opinion, I look at Gallup's most important problems, media, New York Times index. No offense to Michael for looking at the New York Times and not the Post. But there's good reasons why. It's better data sets. The second, the presidential agenda. So here I'm using State of the Union addresses as a sort of a proxy of what presidents are paying attention to. And the sort of most substantial undertaking here was looking at the congressional agenda, or the sort of legislative agenda. So I hand-coded 6,560 congressional hearings over the last half century. Across these 13 distinct policy subsystems, ranging from housing community development to sort of economic development, wastewater management, mass transit, highways, and these sorts of things, right? These meaningful policy subsystems that have sort of strong institutions, strong supportive interests, and administrative agencies that are in charge of administering the policy. And lastly, the content coding I coded for a sort of overarching attention, right, as I mentioned earlier. So treating urban problems as sort of this place-based issue, right, with these sort of social and sort of place-oriented antecedents, right? So treating sort of these urban sort of problems as the problem, right? And then finally, this more sort of problem-oriented attention. So these more sort of discrete level problems that may not necessarily sort of contain attention to how these different things relate, right? So treating them in a sort of a discrete way. So first, to turn attention to the systemic and presidential agendas. You'll have to take my word for it. I promise you that I show this empirically, but in the interest of kind of moving along, it's in the paper. I promise. I look here at, as I've mentioned, the presidential interest and systemic interest, and we see a spike during the Great Society period, and then a precipitous drop in the period after that, which is probably not all that surprising to the folks in this room. Indeed, to sort of attach some data to this, this is comparing the mean comparisons of the Great Society period, so 61 to 68, to the rest of my series, so 69 through 2004. A 57% descent across the rest of the series in public opinion, so the public's interest in urban issues, and a 78% descent in presidential interest. Okay. What was kind of interesting, and I'll just say a quick word about this, the sort of media interest, using the New York Times index here, did not follow the same pattern. And in fact, after the LA riots and then sort of carrying over into the 1990s with the terrorist attacks, then obviously to September 11, 2001, there was a fairly sort of sustained spike. So the media were paying attention to urban issues, right? But the issue here is not in the sort of the way that we used to think about urban issues, right? These are sort of discrete problems like crime and safety, domestic preparedness, and these sort of discrete concerns. So not sort of urban as the problem, but the safety of urban populations as the problem. Okay. So that's president and public opinion. And apologies for the small font there, but this is a lot to show. So what about the legislative agendas? And there's a couple of aspects of the legislative agenda that are of particular importance to me here. And so in the top two rows there, you see what I call the overarching focus, which was the sort of content coding of the hearings. And then policy concentration. Actually, let me pull this off. And policy concentration, which is a Herfindahl-Hirschman index, which is basically a concentration ratio, with higher scores meaning more concentration, lower scores meaning less concentration. And the concentration scores were calculated across the 6 dimensions that you see at the bottom of the figure. So development, health and social welfare, crime and safety, energy and environment, education, and transportation. Okay, so what do we see here? Well, we see in overarching focus a very similar pattern to what we saw in presidential attention, public opinion, and media attention. So a 70% mean percent drop in overarching focus in content coding the hearings, and a 63% or 64%, I should say, drop in the concentration of the sort of issue focus, right? But so how were urban problems portrayed, to get back to the questions that were kind of organizing the talk in the paper? Well, we see a substantial drop in development in health and social welfare from the Great Society period over the rest of the series, but a substantial rise in these more problem-oriented foci that weren't necessarily considered in the sort of context, right, of the sort of traditional, sort of spatial concerns, right? So it was crime and safety issues, sort of irrespective of how they connect spatially, right? It was energy and environmental issues, irrespective of how they connect spatially. So the storyline that kind of emerges here is that the federal urban policy agenda has evolved, and it has disaggregated. from these more and kind of traditional policy subsystems and policy areas, right? Because there's an institutional story that goes along with this dimensionality, right? This is happening in these different policy subsystems, in these different federal agencies, in these different congressional committees. And just a quick note, some prima facie evidence of the fragmentation. So this is the executive order establishing the White House Office of Urban Affairs, scraped directly from it. That's 2/3 of the president's cabinet, for those of you scoring at home. That's no mean feat. Secretary Marquez was talking about the sort of the White House Office of Urban Affairs and their interagency partnerships. That's across 17 different federal agencies. These are not just cabinet level. There's some sort of sub entities as well. But again, no mean feat. So as I say here, urban policies have evolved into these more sort of discrete portrayals, into these more problem-centric policy solutions that don't necessarily consider the sort of spatial and social interconnectedness of these different urban problems. Okay, but one of the things, the sort of the key aspect here that I didn't spend that much talking about because it's difficult to, this is a difficult presentation to give because convincing people that there's still some attention at the federal level to cities takes a while, right? But one of the sort of interesting findings, and I think one of the things that has one of the sort of biggest implications to the current dilemma, if you will, is that key actors over the years have reshaped and reframed urban problems to fit into these sort of institutions in which urban concerns were embedded over the years. By focusing on discrete problems with sort of less urban baggage, right? Or by linking urban issues to issues of more general public concern. I think a prime example of that is the Energy Efficiency Community Block Grant, where you sort of tap into this climate change issue, which is a hot issue at the federal level. And incidentally, right, the storyline is that you're killing two birds with one stone. You're dealing with poverty and energy efficiency all in one fell swoop. And so you're retrofitting buildings, you're putting people to work. Right, that's the sort of treating these sort of a discrete solution with a discrete definition of the problem with a sort of space-based solution. Okay, one of my favorite examples, and I'll end with this, and then just one slide after that, is the case of the Clinton crime bill. So in the systemic agenda, we saw, as I pointed out, a spike in both public and media attention. Basically, it resulted the LA riots, and that was still during the first Bush administration, at the end of the first Bush administration. And so President Clinton obviously had some partisan and some electoral incentives to take urban issues seriously. He actually promised something called an urban policy on the campaign trail. But the first attempt, which was very similar to President Obama's first attempt, a sort of stimulus package, actually was filibustered. So he lost out on sort of calling this thing, right, urban policy. So what does he do? Well, in the Clinton crime bill in 1994, which has a lot of stuff going on in it, don't get me wrong, it's not like it was just sort of a sort of social package, a way to subsidize cities entirely. We had community policing. We had these grants that were actually earmarked for areas with above average crime. So above average crime means central cities, right? Calling these areas above average crime is targeting the resources to cities. And as most of you I'm sure remember, the sort of midnight basketball debate in the Clinton crime bill, right? This was sort of these were social initiatives, but they were embedded in a much larger piece of legislation, right, that had larger goals, but sort of fit a storyline that was existing in the mass media at the time and in the mass public, with crime issues being important, right? So Clinton portrays these urban problems narrowly, but provides sort of place-oriented solutions to them. So the implications. The first is that these discrete policy systems are embedded in more federal institutions, but in the institutions with less of an urban focus, right? So one sort of obvious implication here is that a sort of overarching policy solutions are less likely to emerge since these spatial dilemmas within these different institutions are less central foci, right? So the interconnectedness of these problems is going to be more difficult to deal with over time as urban policy is happening in more and in different places. To put it differently, when I get confused looks, it's like when I'm giving a lecture. If I get confused looks, I will find 8 different ways to say the same thing. I apologize. But there's sort of a second dimension to this story as well, is that legislative gains can be made through this disaggregated action, through reshaping urban policies, right? By reshaping the goals of urban policies to sort of align with these issues that are more hot at the time, or just more discreetly. And so I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next up is William Barnes, who is the Emerging Issues Director for the National League of Cities. I invited him in part because he has been plugged in some ways to the scholarly community through the APSA, but he has had a lot of hands-on experience over the years in various positions with the National League of Cities, and before that, I believe you were tied in with the National Endowment, was it for the Arts or the Smithsonian? I can't remember, but you worked on a book about federal buildings. And
I did?
yes.
Boy, that goes back.
That goes way back.
It was a great
But
book.
what we have done for you all for this particular seminar, and this is available on the table outside, is provide you with a wonderful chapter that gives an overview of sort of the history of urban policy that complements what we just heard from Josh, and that was done as the 40th anniversary essay for the Urban Affairs Review on sort of the history of urban policy. But I've asked Bill to give us some reflection of that, and as well as on what's going on now with the Obama administration, if he has some thoughts on that.
Thank you. My tour then is to give you a little 10 minutes of historical perspective, and then and relate that to the current situation a bit, and then I will bow out. In that article that I didn't expect that it would be distributed, but that the first line of that article was that the era of federal urban policy is like way over. That was written 5 years ago. It remains, in my view, an okay thing to talk about. The statement remains, if ungrammatical, at least leads to interesting thoughts. I think so far from both the Assistant Secretary and from Josh's scholarship, you see some themes around this topic. Sort of old programs, old ways, old culture, new programs, new ways, new culture, narrow focus versus broad focus, and so on. I argued in this article that if there is to be a successful federal attention to urban, metropolitan city issues, it will be successful if it is built on some rethinking and rebuilding of the underlying architecture of ideas, some of which Josh has brought out in his presentation, which is I commend the paper to you. It's an excellent piece of work. I look at the current situation as a struggle between these old, new, narrow, broad kind of things. It is unclear to me how it comes out. Perhaps if the whole world were made up of people like the Assistant Secretary, I would be more optimistic. But not everybody's eggs are in the same basket hers are in. And so there we are. There are real interests at stake. It's not as if there is totally a right and a wrong. So it's an interesting, evolution's the wrong word because it suggests that it has a sort of an end point and a purpose, and a development pattern, but it's historical, right? So we're in the midst of this, and it's really interesting if you're of the mind to be an observer. I want to remind us that by coincidence or not, we are doing this in the 45th year of the existence of HUD. In August of 1965, Congress passed a law that said there will be a Department of Housing and Urban Development, bringing urban and housing and cities to the cabinet table. In that same month, Los Angeles erupted into one of the worst civil disturbances in American history. It is not clear to me which of those two events is more important for the way we have treated cities over the ensuing 45 years. I just wrote something that said that the LA uprising or riot or rebellion or whatever your politics tell you to call it froze much of white America into a view of cities that had to do with plight of cities. I will be happy if I never hear that expression again. Fright, a place to be afraid of, and flight, a place to flee. Whether you and that view of urban America, we are not completely free of that view. And I think that Josh's work suggests the importance of these kind of underlying views of what we're talking about. The standard periodization of the history of urban policy, we all probably have in our heads. There is a wonderful book by Mark Gelfand called The Nation of Cities that covers the period up through the establishment of HUD. We don't have anything like that for the later period, and somebody should do it. And I lament that in this article that's out there on the table. It is, but there is nonetheless a pervasive view about what urban policy since the Great Society. That there was this urban policy in the Great Society, and then there was a, to use Matthew Arnold, a melancholy, long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. In other words, the federal government withdrew. I love the words, so thank you for letting me read them. We have Gelfand's book. I say we have. I have also, but if I loaned that to one of you in this room, I wish you would return it because I can't find my copy, but it's a good book. At any rate, the Carter urban policy is well known, but it was a paper tiger. It was followed by virtually nothing. And it was a huge exercise in policy development in the late 70s, involved a lot of very intelligent people, and did not produce a lot of new programs and legislation. There were other things done by the Carter administration outside that framework that were successful. So you've got this Great Society image, you've got this Carter urban policy, and then you've got the dreaded to urban policy people, Ronald Reagan and afterward, of the withdrawal of federal attention to cities, where the percentage of city budgets that comes from the federal government goes from 17% to 4%, and sort of a nobody cares kind of politics around the way people talk about this. I suggest for your consideration that the real urban policy initiative and hypothesis, the successful urban policy initiative was none of these. It was Richard Nixon and the activist Democratic Congress of 1972, 73, 74, when Nixon increasingly couldn't pay attention. He had other things on his mind in those years, but the pattern of block grants, which we are still living with, and which is the big shift to what the Assistant Secretary said is still around, which is the locals know best. And that deference to the local definition of agenda and of how to do it, and the sort of receding of the feds into a monitoring of how did you spend the money yet. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong, and in the face of federal meddling and mandates and preemptions, there's a lot to be said for locals know best. but maybe there's a more successful mix of federal partnering. I don't think that federal goal setting and enforcement is the same as partnering skills, and I think that would be an interesting conversation with the Assistant Secretary about how she thinks about that. But at any rate, those years gave us a legacy that is still embedded, and we come then to 30 years of withdrawal, Matthew Arnold type withdrawal, and now we have the Obama promise of the metro frame and so on. I want to just note, I did a piece last summer that picked out what I thought were the four major themes in the Obama speeches on this urban policy topic, where he said the old ways of thinking are not useful anymore. We have to move to new ways of thinking. In other words, that he was prepared for his administration to rethink the underlying frameworks for urban policy. Four major themes. One is metropolitan regions, not just central cities. Second is seeing what the Assistant Secretary practically quoted the President, seeing cities as part of the solution, not just part of the problem. What she didn't mention, a confusing statement, at least to me, from the President, that anti-poverty policy and urban policy are not the same things, and mixing them together may not produce the best outcomes. So sorting that poverty and urban out. And fourth, getting people to work across the silos, to break down the silos, sort of an anti-silo statement. So those are kind of the themes of the Obama promise. How far that goes, we don't know. There is this sense of disappointment about the White House Office of Urban Policy. It's not visible. Maybe that's not, as she suggested, maybe that's not what ought to happen, that the White House office sort of take this over. The always optimistic Neil Pierce suggested that maybe if the White House isn't going to do this, there will be spontaneous urban policy of the sort of collaborations that she was mentioning. There is a question whether spontaneously done things can become embedded and institutionalized, whether they will last beyond the persons who are engaged. But it is an interesting phenomenon of these collaborative discussions that are going on right now. I want to make the point that, related to Josh's research, that there remains no conceptual, theoretical, analytic connection between urban policy, urban programs, and the economic difficulties that we are in and the economic strategies that are being used. There are programmatic places where there's claim being made, but if I keep going back to the White House website under their list of issues, and you look under urban policy, it doesn't say anything about the economy, and you look under the economy, it doesn't say anything about urban. And I would submit that until there is a way of thinking about the economy that incorporates this metropolitan reality that the President wants to talk about, until we get to that, we are talking about a sandbox with good toys in it, called urban policy. The last thing I want to do is raise one more question along the lines that Josh raised. He raised the question about what's the mission target here? Are we talking about city? Are we talking about metropolitan area? Are we talking about suburb? I have a wonderful quote from Senator Joe Clark in 1965 in which he uses all these words in the same paragraph. The result is that you simply do not know what this new HUD is supposed to be. And we still talk that way. We still do that. And the President's speeches, when he runs up against a hard question, still does the same thing. It just elides into all of the above. I want to add to the point, and there's the functional targeting, housing and so on, what's urban. There's also the archaeology point, which is that a program goes in place It doesn't disappear. It continues. The block grant is the best idea, the CD illustration, the CD block grant. And you get an archaeology of urban policy, right? And if you are to understand what is happening, you must understand the whole archaeology. You cannot just focus on the new discussion, right? So the points I made, I cited from the Obama speeches are not enough to, that's what he brings. But if you want to understand what is actually happening, you have to go down and look at the whole archaeology. And one of the interesting things about what's happening at HUD is looking at the CD block grant, re-looking at that, right? Sort of digging deep, finding what's down there, bringing it back out, saying, how can we connect this to some of these different ideas? How, as she said, to link it to other programs. So there are legacies, and those legacies matter. History matters. And the last thing I will do here is just, I won't read the whole thing. I'm just going to mention categories from this report that I mentioned that was delivered from the University of Pennsylvania to the HUD secretary last January. It's available on the web. It's couple hundred pages. You don't really want to download it, but you may. But it's chapter by chapter, 17 chapters, one on foreclosure, one on public housing, and so on. Really interesting stuff. Hal Woman, who's sitting right directly opposite me here, chaired one of the groups that put together a report there, and there were people who have worked in this field who produced these reports. So 10, 12, 15 people got on the phone, yelled at each other for a while. Somebody tried to put a report together, and then they reviewed it. But at any rate, there's legacy ideas there. At the very least, you'd have to say this is the accumulated wisdom of a bunch of people on the Democratic Party, Democratic side of things about what HUD needs to do. So one of the themes, there's the editors, I guess, of the whole thing reported that there are several common themes across these things. One of them I asked her about the need for culture change at HUD. I was in several of these discussions, and then the word dysfunctional was just thrown around, and no one argued about that. So HUD culture, putting urban development, number two, putting urban development back into HUD. HUD has become primarily a housing agency. What about the urban development agenda? What would that mean? Does it mean connecting to other agencies? And frankly, if you're going to talk about that, where is land use in all of this? God forbid. Number three, reclaim some mandates that have been lost to other agencies. That's real inside Washington stuff that I won't try to go into. Work creatively with other agencies to combine HUD's place focus with the people focus of some of these other agencies and an interagency approach. You see her responding to that here. Relearning, HUD needs to relearn how to partner with businesses, community groups, state and local governments, and so on. I think the partnering skills point is a very big one. And then the last one, HUD's research data and analytic capacity have stagnated. And that's been true for a very long time and would be a theme that would come back. So those are kind of legacies that the people at HUD and elsewhere are dealing with in order to be able to move things forward and be effective with their new ideas. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Bill. We'll have to maybe during the question period get into a little bit about your current title as emerging issues director, because one gets the impression from what has been said so far that we're really discovering a lot of old wine, maybe in new bottles, but maybe there's a different taste to it or something. I'm not sure, but maybe someone who can bring this together as our cleanup hitter is Michael Fletcher, who staff writer for the Washington Post. He's been there since 1995. He's covered a lot of economic issues from U.S. Export growth to the plight of low-wage earners. But his current beat, as I mentioned, is the Obama administration. And he did a very excellent article in October, which I saw that called his name to my attention, one on the new urban policies that are being developed in the administration, and not coincidentally, the month before that he did an excellent article on all the policy czars in the White House, and of course one of those is the new Director of Urban Affairs in the White House. So he is, I think, connecting some dots there, which is a phrase we've heard in some other contexts in this town, but I thought it'd be excellent to have him give some of his reflections on the Obama administration and as their policies relate to jobs and urban affairs and so on. So, Michael, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks a lot, Don. It's funny, as I think about urban policy, the issue that to me most parallels it is the issue of race. I spent maybe 4 or 5 years as a race relations reporter at the Washington Post before moving on to cover education and later the Bush White House and now the Obama White House. And it's interesting, urban policy like race, I mean, these are important cutting-edge issues, and I'm telling you that the policymakers think about these things, politicians think about them, but no national politician, I think, sees an advantage in talking about them, at least by their name. You know, there's just too much baggage, as Josh suggested. If Obama, particularly the first black president, were to talk explicitly much about race or talk about urban policy, I think you'll see, you know, kind of a bigger blowback than you're seeing about the stimulus plan and some of the other things that he's done. So much like with Clinton, I think what you see Obama doing is sort of implementing an urban policy but calling it everything else. And he's doing it through, you know, a number of the traditional silos, and again, trying to encourage these silos to kind of break down their walls and move together. Because when you step back and look at what he's done individually, I think he's basically has the makings of implementing the sort of the most meaningful urban policy since the Great Society. I don't know if, you know, William agrees with this or you guys agree, but it feels like that to me if you just look at the dollar figures, and you don't have to really look that far beyond the stimulus plan to see kind of like where he's trying to go with this. I think the real test will be, you know, whether he can sustain it, you know, given the kind of atmosphere of fiscal austerity that we have now, whether this is something that he'll find support for in the Congress and going on and on. But if you go through the list of issues, you'll see that he's done a lot. In education, there have been huge funding increases. I think we kind of take it for granted now. I mean, for so many years, I think, you know, the federal share of education spending was roughly 7 or 8%, and he's increased that dramatically. He's increased the amount of money going to public schools. They've started this Race to the Top program, which is, you know, it sounds small in comparison to the federal budget, but it's a big, big federal program, $4.35 billion for schools that are willing to reform themselves around the country. And in the next budget, he's going to have over $1 billion in that. I mean, that's huge, and most of that money is going to probably end up in urban areas, even though, I mean, if the president were here, he'd deny it, you know, because I think, again, because of kind of the political kind of atmosphere surrounding these things and all the images that are conjured by the word urban and what have you. And you go on, you know, to other issues, health care. Now, we can argue about whether it's going to happen now. I tend to think it won't, given what happened in Massachusetts and all of that. But if he were successful with that, and if he finds a way to somehow revive his health care plan, that would be a huge, huge kind of transfer of wealth to mainly, you know, working families and people who are working for the kinds of firms that can't afford to offer health care and that kind of thing, the people who can't afford to buy health care. That would be a huge, huge sort of transformation of the kind of the urban landscape out there in a sense, you know, through healthcare. And if he's able to pull that off, again, I mean, that's something, I mean, you call it what you will, but I think that's urban policy, and that's something that's dramatic. You know, weatherization was mentioned, and it's, you know, and it's canny, these guys, because they talk about it through kind of the environmental lens. They look at it that way. But you're talking about job training programs, you're talking about retrofitting largely old housing stock, and that's largely in our urban centers, or at least in our near-in suburbs. And again, this is playing into kind of an urban policy. But again, President Obama is not going to call it an urban policy because, again, there's no political payoff, I think, in talking about that. So you see that again and again and again as you go across kind of the policy spectrum. Transportation is another thing. There have been changes there, and a lot of this stuff is like in the regulations and what have you. But there's more emphasis now on public transportation. You look in the stimulus package, money for high-speed rail, more money for mass transit. Sort of the formulas have been changed for mass transit funding to make it more favorable for cities to build subways and what have you. The cost-benefit analysis has been changed a little bit. So I think, again, all of these things are kind of moving in the right direction. But at the same time, again, I can't make the point enough. He won't talk about it much. Before coming over here today, the Washington Post website kind of has a graphic where we sort of list, every day we list the president's appointments and things he's talking about on his public schedule. And if you look, and we kind of have it in blocks, you'll see the economy, it's a big one. National security is a big one, and so on. Urban policy is a subset in there, and it's a tiny, tiny thing. I can think of 2 events off the top of my head. There was one in July where he talked about urban policy, and the recent speech, I believe, at one of the groups. I was out in Ohio. I can't remember who it was.
Last Wednesday.
Last Wednesday, yeah, I was out when he did that. So he doesn't sort of make it a very visible thing. Carry on the urban czar. I interviewed him for the one piece that Don mentioned. You don't see him around the White House. He's not in the briefing room. It's actually hard to get to see him. It feels like they're kind of hiding him back in the recesses of the old executive office building. But, he's there doing what the Assistant Secretary said, from what all I can tell, in terms of trying to bring agencies together. And this is pretty kind of unglamorous stuff, trying to get departments to work together across silos and across that. So I think all of that, is beginning to happen. But the thing that I think remains to be seen is what's going to happen going forward, particularly on the budget side. The president unveils his budget next week. We're hearing already, the White House reporters, we're hearing that there's going to be a domestic spending freeze. So there'll be no budget increases on discretionary spending next year. Now, you can reorganize within your department, you can emphasize certain programs, but there's no new money because of all the furor around the deficit. So all of that, all these things play into kind of where will urban policy be. And from the newspaper's point of view, from the media point of view, that's been a whole nother interesting kind of dynamic. When I started in the newspapers 30 years ago, every newspaper had kind of a HUD reporter, any big newspaper. People, if you were a local newspaper, you covered housing, you covered urban, you sometimes had an urban affairs beat, you'd have a race beat. At the Washington Post, we have almost none of that now. Certainly not, I'm on the national staff, none of that. I wrote this story about the urban initiatives from the White House beat, but we have no HUD reporter, the Washington Post, and we cover Washington pretty closely. But we tend to cover Washington politics. We cover urban stuff on the Hill some, but really only as it relates to some other issue. If it's an earmark, or we're writing about a certain congressman, but we're not talking about kind of the general thrust. And I think the feeling is maybe the editors feel the same way that some of the politicians feel, like maybe there's a certain fatigue around this. I think something, maybe the image that's conjured when you say urban is one of dysfunction, one of like, okay, it's the same old story. This stuff isn't working, and we don't really want to put our increasingly scarce resources into that. So I think all of that sort of leads to kind of urban policy not rising up. The politicians are scared to talk about it, and the press, frankly, is not as interested in it as we used to be. It remains to be seen whether that. I don't think that's going to change really unless the politicians find the courage or find some way to talk about this in a way that's that they feel like is to their advantage. I'll leave it there and open it up for any questions.
Okay. Thank you very much. Forgot to mention that before coming to the Post in '95, Michael had worked for, I think, 15 years with the Baltimore Sun. Yeah. Is that correct?
Yeah, 13, yeah.
And you had an urban beat there, so you saw city politics up close. And I'm just wondering, is that also being slighted in recent coverage as far as the Post goes? Or are they still paying? I mean, you still have a metro section. Are they pretty good on that?
We still cover. We do a decent job, and our investigative people focus on D.C. quite a bit. We had a series some months ago I thought was really good about the AIDS administration. It's sort of like how federal money is spent and not really watched well. So we do, I think, sort of particularly kind of sporadically, but very good when we do it sporadically. But I don't think there's not this sort of continuous coverage. I mean, if you can make a big splash and write a series about it, they're happy to have it. But I don't think there's that much interest in kind of the day-to-day kind of grind of it.
I don't know if maybe the incentive is no longer there to start reporting on local politics, but that's what gave Woodward and Bernstein their shot up the ladder, was covering the break-in of the Watergate, and following that story. Let's take questions from the audience. We have about 10 or 15 minutes left here, so please raise your hand, wait for a microphone, and give your name and affiliation. Yes, back in the corner there, sir.
Bill Orleans, and I really have no affiliation. I really sort of want to get back to the exasperation question, what about land use with regard to, apparently it was emanating from the University of Pennsylvania report. But Mr. Fletcher, I'm curious, I sort of come from a sort of progressive small town, small city. It's a member of NLC, and it's local. It's nearby. There's no real perception among folks who are engaged in a whole range of activities in the small town of their relationship beyond the small town. Sometimes they'll identify as residents of a county, the county. Occasionally there will be a discussion of the relationship to the state. But being residents of metropolitan Washington is almost has to be wrested from them, the recognition that indeed we're a small part of a much larger community, in the core of which is the District of Columbia. I don't know, I guess the Post and also the Sun, which some of us read still, although I can't imagine why at this point, there's so little in it. But it's not the fault necessarily.
I still subscribe.
It's not necessarily the fault of the two papers' declining revenues and therefore declining numbers of beat reporters that's responsible. But I certainly appreciate it when I can open up the paper in the morning, whatever paper it is, and see in-depth stories about local stuff, especially when it relates to the larger community. But Mr. Barnes, my question really is to you. I'm so thrilled, actually. I'm really excited when somebody brings up the subject of land use, and I don't know if this was your own exasperated question, having read that University of Pennsylvania thing.
That was just me.
Well, in fact, I think that's a very important question.
But you know, you and I are really weird.
Well, we may be, but I think
being interested in land use is not exactly.
The absence of interest in land use is what results in both the center city and the periphery having bad development policy decisions made, and consequently down the line leading to bad transportation policies and bad housing siting policies. I just bring up, and I'm going to hand the microphone back, I just bring up the several WMATA station sites that remain undeveloped many years after the construction of the lines were completed. Local folks want a shopping center and an office complex and structured parking. I don't see that as useful to economic development or appropriate urban policy in greater metropolitan Washington.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Any comments on land use? I just happen to remember, and you probably go back this far too, in the 1970s when there was talk even of some national land use planning, and there was a huge explosion. I mean, a big reaction against that. And
Henry Jackson went so far as to draw up legislation that got some discussion. But it is a land use for local government people. Land use is a core, an important thing that they control, that they have authority over. They don't control it; they have authority over it. That's a very hard discussion, but it is one of the land use, the economy, maybe some other things. Are the kind of things that cut across everything, and that would be a strategic, high leverage tool to use if you were really trying to do a strategic policy. And the lack of that sort of thing, I commented about the economy before, the lack of that sort of thing suggests to me that we are still very much in the urban conception of urban policy that the wonderful Royce Hansen once described as a basket of things that mayors want. So in other words, it is programmatic response to constituencies that are important. That's really good stuff. That's, I mean, I've spent my career around all of that. I have no sort of major radical objection to it, but it is not the same as a strategic policy that tries to move a lot of things with high leverage moves. So I appreciate your joining me in this weird interest in land use.
Josh, any comments, or Michael? No? All right, other questions? Yes, sir.
Hal Woolman, George Washington University. So it's pretty clear, listening to the panel, that the answer to the question, national urban policy, is a new day dawning, is no.
No, I didn't try to load that question.
No.
I mean, I think it's a legitimate question.
Well, let me put it a little different. If by national urban policy we mean the kind of overarching national urban policy that Josh referred to, I think the answer is no. And I think Josh and Bill both accurately described the evolution of the way in which cities and urban areas are treated. So I guess the question I have is the fact that we are not about to adopt that kind of overarching national urban policy, and I'll include Michael's comments in that as well, for reasons that in many cases are political. Is that a bad thing or a good thing, or should we be worried about what do we lose when we forego the kind of strategic look at our urban needs and relationships and instead rely on disaggregated programs that are politically possible but not strategically connected? What do we lose, and is it something we should be worried about?
Since I have the mic, I wanted to add on to that also. Doesn't that make it almost impossible to break out of silos then, if that's the only way to move ahead in urban agenda is in this disaggregated fashion? I mean, how are you supposed to break out of these silos? That's the goal, of the Obama administration in urban policy.
I think one of the things that is lost, to answer your question, is kind of the possibility to expand the possibilities. I mean, I think there is probably a political case to be made for having an urban policy, but where's the politician that's who's gonna risk that? I think that's one of the key things that's lost. I think some of the planning can go on behind the scenes. I think that's a lot of what Carrion is doing now, planning across the silos, so it doesn't get talked about as an overarching policy, but maybe can be implemented at least somewhat as one. And I think the political realities of Congress also, in a way, stand in the way of that, because you're not going to have a really, truly sort of space-based kind of policy because of the spoil system in Congress. No congressman is going to sit around and watch, their urban neighbor, get more money than them. There's going to have to be some kind of payoff for that. So I mean that's like one of the checks on it. But I really think there is some potential there. There would be some payoff there, at least, if the president or other sort of respected leaders talked more in kind of an overarching way.
Yeah. Bill?
I think Michael's comments are very wise, and your analogy to race, I think it illuminates the point even further, that there is a value to the larger discussion, for opening possibilities rather than channeling possibilities. And in this regard, I want to commend Wendell Pritchett's new biography of Robert Weaver, which shows the relationship between race and urban policy, federal involvement in urban affairs over the middle 40 years of the century. I think, in addition to the possibilities that are in addition to losing the potential of raising new possibilities, is the loss of a search for, well, how do we move all of this in a relatively simple way, right? How do we conceive of urban development patterns as something that we want to make go in a certain direction? Now, it may be that we don't want that. I mean, it's a matter of getting it right. right? But there is a discussion there that is above a program. On the other hand, I admired the list that Michael made about the way that things are getting done, right? And I agree with that, and we can add to that list. And so one doesn't want to say that that only if the Holy Grail is found is anything any good, right? That there is a way to muddle through, which is there are better and worse ways to muddle through, and it makes a hell of a difference whether you do it better or worse. So
just before the panel began, I was commenting on an article by William Chambra from the winter issue of National Affairs Journal. It's called Obama and the Policy Approach, and basically, and he's, as I recall, an expert on the progressive era, but showing this great faith that we've had over the last century, you know, in experts and scientific methods and so on, and the idea of how nice it would be if we had comprehensive, rational planning and policies and so on, but how they run up against the political system where things are disaggregated because of the nature of our federalist system, the nature of our diverse districts and so on. It's exactly what Michael was talking about. So he's sort of putting a wet blanket on the idea that you can have comprehensive policies given the nature of our political system. And he cites past examples, whether it's Carter or Bill Clinton's health bill or some other things where they just ran up against a wall. But you wanted to make a comment too, I believe.
Yeah, I do. In two comments, actually. And in relation to the issue of sort of, you know, coordinated, comprehensive federal policymaking, Don Kettle's work on this most recently is particularly relevant as well. And Kettle's argument basically is that, you know, these existing policymaking boundaries, silos, subsystems, if you will, networks, are essentially ill-equipped to handle the sort of new complexities of the sort of contemporary reality. And a couple of the examples that he uses are Homeland Security as a response to Katrina, and these sort of, you know, trying to coordinate across these different subsystems, ranging from food safety to technological hazards to domestic preparedness, and all these disparate things that you know heretofore have had no relation to one another, and they're supposed to kind of be talking to one another and you know and coordinating. I do want to respond quickly to the ought question, and to point out that I'm not really in the ought business, but I am in the is business, and so I would counter Professor Woolman's question with whether this is a sort of a bad or good thing by asking, is there a constituency for a comprehensive or coordinated national urban policy? And so I was before I came over, I was actually perusing the Conference of Mayors website, and so they had an agenda. They just had their meeting recently, and they had the agenda. And so I did a couple of word searches. One was for the actual words "urban policy" together, and only found a couple mentions. And another was White House Office of Urban Affairs. I did a bunch of searches: WHOUA, White House Office of Urban Affairs, with, you know, in parentheses, and there was nary a mention on their website. And they just had the meeting, right? The USCM, where they were essentially developing their legislative agenda. Now, what was on there were re-upping and increasing the energy efficiency block grants, the infrastructure development, right? Sort of pressuring the president to follow through on the promises he made in the campaign, and CDBG. So I guess I would. So, you know, the sort of odd question I don't feel as well qualified to answer, but I don't see at this point in time really a constituency, people putting pressure on the federal government to coordinate, to cohere.
We started late, so let's just take one more question, then we'll continue the discussion in our at a reception outside the room here. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you. My name is Rick Rybeck. I'm with the firm Just Economics. And listening to the discussion, especially the last couple of questions and the talk about land use, I'm thinking that sprawl has invaded our intellectual life, perhaps. I used to work for local government, state and local government. I used to work for the District of Columbia, both at the legislative and the executive level for the last 20 years. And government at all levels, federal, state, and local, has lied to people for a long time. I mean, the whole process of suburbanization and building the infrastructure that made suburbanization possible. So a tremendous transfer of wealth from the cities and some from the countryside to this new place that's very unsustainable environmentally, economically, almost in every which way. We have about 10 times as much infrastructure as we need per capita because of the way we've sprawled across the landscape, and again, that has tremendous environmental and economic consequences, not to mention the energy and all the other things. But I don't think we have any way of talking about that. And you know, when you ask, well, you know, does it matter? The question is, can we talk about economic policy and racial policy or all these other things as if place doesn't matter? Can we, you know, I mean, we've told this lie, you know, that promoted, you know, and now people are locked into living in places that are unsustainable. As has been mentioned, you know, no congressman is going to tell the people in their district, well, you're not living in a sustainable place. You've either got to change it radically or go somewhere else. So, you know, people perpetuate the lie or refuse to, you know, look at the emperor without any clothes. So, you know, I think my sense is that, you know, given the problems of sustainability, that's not going to be a sustainable way. But the question I would pose to the panel is, well, if we've been telling this lie for so long, how do we get out of it? How do we start easing people into talking about the truth?
What's the lie?
That place doesn't matter.
Well, I think we'll take that one out into the hall and discuss it further. Please join me in thanking our panel.